Happy Sabbath, everybody. Ben tanche. Dale McCreary dish na cashon. Egwan mit chifnia, Hazelton, BC Ostja. Bella Kula Maga Egwan the weekend. My name's Dale McCreary. I'm a Métis man from Hazelton, British Columbia, born and raised there, but with our family from northern Alberta. And I now live and work as a linguist and a language teacher in Bella Kula. I am a graduate of Burman, back before it was called Burman. And I've spent a lot of time falling asleep in Vespers right over there. I always found that at the end of a week, 1 hour of sleep in church was worth 2 hours of sleep anywhere else. So, for me, there's something very foundational about the idea that if you tell me the right thing to do and I do it, I'm in a better place, but that's not really growth. I haven't changed in a meaningful way. However, if you share your experiences with me, or the experiences of your family and community, the impact is very different. You know, I can learn from those experiences, I can make thoughtful decisions. Then not only am I in a better place afterwards, I've also grown as a child of God. You know, the reality is when we actually listen to other people share their experiences, it's impossible not to grow or to be changed. As Christians, this is what I understand Jesus to be saying when he tells us to seek and you will find, or to taste and see that the Lord, he is good, or when Jesus or the prophet Nathan spoke in parables, or when we read that because we have all been exposed to nature, we have no excuse for not understanding God's character in our lives. So today I'm going to start by sharing some experiences. Now, I remember being a kid, listening to the guys talk after Sabbath dinner, discussing books, maybe Adventist hot potatoes, or things that had happened in our community in the past. You know, how so-and-so came to the church, and what happened with this person. And listening to these people talk was how I learned what mattered to my community. You know, one day, I think I was maybe 11 or 12, I remember a man named Dwight Johnson saw me reading Secrets of the Lost Races by Renee Norbergen. He asked me what I thought about it, and then he disagreed with me completely and shared his impressions of the book. I wasn't upset. In fact, I was blown away that he respected me enough to take my thoughts seriously. I mean, he could have just nodded and said, "Good for you that you're reading." But he didn't. He felt that I deserved to be engaged with. And I remember it as the first time, or one of the first times, that I was treated as an adult. You know, he respected me, listened to me, then shared his experiences, and I listened. You know, my grandparents and aunt and uncle, Wendy and Dean, had taken a trip to Europe, somewhere around that time. And my grandpa would tell me about some of the places they'd seen where the Waldensians had lived. Let's see. You know what? I just skipped a whole paragraph. I'm like, something seems wrong here. Now, when I start thinking of the stories that shaped who I am and helped me understand my relationship to my community, to my church community, to my cultural community, the first place my mind usually goes is to my grandpa's stories. He was humble, very honest, very open, and when he spoke, he was usually just trying to equip me to face life's challenges. He didn't seem to have too much of an agenda. Considering how hard I had to work to pry them out of him, that's probably a good indicator. We would talk about his experiences as well as the experiences of others that mattered to him and stories that mattered to him. One of those stories was that of the Vaudois or the Valdesi or Waldensians, the group of Christians that we know as the Israel of the Alps, or the main topic of the 4th chapter of the Great Controversy book by Ellen White. Now, as I said earlier, my grandparents, my aunt and uncle took a trip to Europe, and my grandpa would tell me about some of the places they'd seen where the Waldensians had lived, or caves where they had hidden churches, and I would use my imagination to fill in the gaps in his stories using the characters and scenery described in books that he and Grandma had given us over the years. Books like Home to Our Valleys, or The Wrath of the King by Walter Utt, or Brave Men to the Battle by Virgil Robinson. And, these were stories of battles, victories, losses, tragedies, desperate nighttime flights in the winter, people facing impossible fears with impossible bravery. There were stories of children stolen and kept for years in harsh schools, rescues, and much more. After many years, this past year, I had my own opportunity to go to the foothills of the Alps, and through finding yet more books and having more conversations with people who live there and seeing many of the places for myself, like, I loved the seminary, like a 700-year-old seminary built out of stone, high up in the mountains. I learned a lot more about their 600 years of resilience in the face of persecution for their differences. I learned more of a people who, because of their unwillingness to accept the idea of authority inherent in anybody other than God, would face persecution. They were mistrusted by the powerful no matter how hard they tried to show their loyalty. No matter how many of them volunteered to serve in their whatever armies of the countries they were a part of, the best they could ever do was delay the next round of persecution, when once again armed men would take their farms and abuse people until they either assimilated or fled to distant lands. I learned that these people were forced to live and work within certain boundaries. They were denied many opportunities available to others. And even as Italy became a democracy, they were not initially allowed to vote and still had to fight to get the boarding schools closed that many of their children had been taken to for generations. These stories were exciting, but as you might guess, there was more than one reason I believe that they resonated with my grandpa. One of the reasons was because of the experiences of the Waldensians mirrored in many ways the experiences of our family or the broader Métis community, not to mention other Indigenous communities of Canada. As Christians, we know the history of the peace of Christ, the Pax Christos, and how it was a threat to the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which was sort of the agreement that the Roman Empire gets all the money and the land, and everyone else gets peace and good governments and gets to make a living, and it's made possible by the threat of overwhelming violence, the military power of Rome. Rome eventually felt so threatened by people who didn't need that violence in order to be good, that Pax Christos, that they had to take it over and change it to suit their own needs. And many of these changes have been following Christianity and going along with empires to this day. Christianity helping people cope with the results of the traumas of displacement and destruction, while also at times serving to justify the whole process. Now, I'm a part of the Métis community, and for us, our parallel journey to this began really with the arrival of empire to a group of communities that didn't really need it. The government arrived in the form of surveyors measuring lines across our farms to sell them. We negotiated a treaty called the Manitoba Act in 1869, but instead of the British soldiers that we had requested to come and oversee the handover of power, a different group came from Ontario and instead seized power for themselves, with many of their descendants still owning much of Winnipeg today in our former farms. For 15 years, we were denied what was promised to us in the treaty, that being land for our children and grandchildren, as our members were gradually driven out through constant violence and open land theft, which continued despite constant letters being sent to the Government of Canada. And then when we were given the rights to land, we were sort of scattered across the landscape by lottery, where a father would be given a farm here, and a son would be given one 200 kilometers that way, and another son 200 kilometers that way, with the goal of breaking up our communities so that we would never have a voice or an influence on the people who were coming in. When the same things started to happen along the North Saskatchewan River, where many of us had fled, seeking a place safe from what was going on back around Winnipeg, we sent for a young school teacher living in Montana, a young Sabbath-keeping man who had studied with Adventists there. Born October 22nd, 1844, his name was Louis Riel, and his goal was to help us try and resolve the tension and achieve some of the vision that we had when we negotiated the Manitoba Act. The short version of the story is that we tried to find middle ground, but armies usually aren't looking for that. They're not looking to solve problems, they're looking to win. And after negotiations failed, we lost at the Battle of Batoche, and the dark times that had begun in 1869 didn't really just continue, they got a lot worse. One of my friend's babysitters still remembers, well, she's passed away now, but remembered clearly being young and how she watched the men ride off to Batoche. She could describe their clothing, how their horses moved. All of these memories were clear in her mind because of what happened next. The military who had come stripped every house for souvenirs, And those who didn't flee the country mostly found themselves with no food or no homes. Reprisals were very common. I listened to another man share his grandpa's story of hiding under the floor while his dad and grandpa were killed above because they were suspected of being a part of the resistance. For the next many years, Métis people who didn't hide their identity were largely barred from schools, or depending how they were seen, were forced to go to residential schools. The laws that were put in place and the banking practices largely prevented us from homesteading or purchasing land, so we instead formed communities on the unoccupied road allowances that have been surveyed across the prairies, places like Roostertown or Sainte-Madeleine, and we began to be known as the road allowance people. Sainte-Madeleine is where the woman who taught me to speak Michif was born. 1 second. I think it's my glasses that are getting blurry. There. And this woman, she told me how in 1939, the RCMP and the local farmers came in the night, burnt the church, the post office, the school, shot their dogs and their cows, and drove the people off into the wintry night as they burnt their homes behind them. You know, I met another man who told me that 3 times he watched his family's home burnt as he and his family and friends were shipped north in freight cars to be dumped on the side of the tracks. The last time because Winnipeg wanted to build a new swimming pool. These were in the mid to late 50s. There was a lot of abuse and violence that I won't talk about. You know, the 60s scoop where thousands of our children were taken, the forced sterilizations, but through it all, people kept hope. They kept fighting for a future and for children, and eventually things started to change. You know, residential schools are now largely the stories of grandparents, but the experiences are still with us. You know, hurt people. And we're still working on undoing in our children what was done to us over generations. Now, my own family was affected by this history as well. You know, shortly after the Second Resistance along the North Saskatchewan in 1885, one of my Métis great-great-grandmas living near Musqueam, her name was Betsy Bruno, was abandoned by her husband along with their 4 children, Bella, Anna, Nancy, and Jimmy. You know, Betsy passed away shortly after, and the kids were sent to the residential school at Onion Lake, which is now in Saskatchewan. Their daughter Bella ran away at 15, got married, and moved to Buffalo Lake, which I think is near Stettler or near Kikino. She then died just after giving birth to her only child, Annie, my great-grandma, named after her sister, who was still in school. Shortly after that, baby Annie and her grandparents moved to Kunuso, another small community north of Edmonton. When Bella's sisters left school, they never could find out where she had gone, as she had already passed away. Baby brother Jimmy ran away at 12, going some 300 kilometers hoping to find his father, but no luck. Annie grew up with her grandparents, and as far as I know, was never able to go to school. Then she married my great-grandpa quite young. Not too long after the birth of their children, including my grandpa Rex, she left the children while her husband was out trapping. And the kids made do for themselves for a while, you know, giving them stories of kids hunting by themselves and making do with more or less nothing. Stories that I loved as a kid, but now that I'm a parent, are pretty unsettling. You know, looking at this family history, you can see that even in a community of very resilient people, with lots of love and support, there's no way to avoid being impacted, especially in terms of what people value and what we're working towards. Now, when my grandpa's father came back from the trapline, he wanted an education for his kids. So he and his boys, including my grandpa, worked on the trap lines for the winters to pay for room and board for the girls to attend the town school. The girls found it very hard, as they were the only known Métis students attending and were made to feel quite unwelcome. Through all of this, my grandpa Rex himself didn't get that much education. He married my grandma Phyllis, then learned about the Adventist church through her. This resulted in them making the long move to Hazelton, BC, because they had heard of an Adventist school there, and they felt that this might be the school that could give their children the future they wanted for them. 15 years later, my mother found herself in a crowd of her friends and their families, waiting to catch the Greyhound East out of New Hazelton. But while my mother was heading to Lacombe to go to start grade 10 at CUC, now PAA, her friends were going to Lee Jack in Edmonton to residential school. Now, I want to give you guys an understanding of the difference between these two destinations. And I'll preface it by saying that I did grow up on stories of some of the challenges and injustices that my mother and my uncles and my aunts faced at CUC. But the real difference was this. CUC was a school that aimed to make thinkers, not mere repeaters of other men's thoughts, while residential school was a system designed and operated in order to stop people from thinking, and instead make them only repeaters of other men's thoughts, or maybe just seen and not heard. One friend told me how, while in residential school, his teacher asked a question in class, and since he knew the answer from his own stubborn reading, he answered, only to be beaten by the teacher in front of the class and told, "You don't learn anything that I don't teach you." The same man explained to me that often teachers and staff were recruited from ex-military officers who were told that their new students were just like the worst of their drunk recruits and needed to be dealt with in the same way. So this attitude and preparation is what helped foster an atmosphere where creativity and initiative was seen as rebellion, and most students were left feeling very powerless and without a voice throughout their lives, something that, of course, will impact your children and your grandchildren as well. Now, this atmosphere is really strongly reflected in curriculum. For example, I've always loved collecting language textbooks. My favorite probably, I have ones talking about, a whole collection talking about the glories of the Soviet Union. And one of my friends, yes, how it has turned the utopia of yesterday into the reality of today. One of my friends has one where it's a phrase book for Hungarian, and it says, "Where is the mayor? Escaped, captured, or shot?" And then how to get to the center of the city, by foot or by tank. But I found a copy a long time ago of a Cree language textbook, Cree English language textbook for residential schools. And it includes a list of phrases, it was from Alberta, it includes a list of phrases or letters that kids were to copy out, including gems like, "I do not want to live in a tent anymore," or "wear a blanket," or "I shall never ask for a blanket or rations," or "Mom and Dad, why does the government not give you coat and pants instead of blankets that make people look foolish and lazy?" These instructional methods of copying things out are based on strict obedience, and that's pretty much all they teach. In contrast, here's the preface to an Adventist textbook from 35 years previous, back in 1855. A quote, "The remarkable success which has attended Professor Bell's methods of teaching English in Battle Creek College has created a rapidly increasing demand for copies of his lessons. Some of the students have been so desirous of using these lessons and teaching elsewhere that they have at great expense procured copies by the use of the pen. This increasing demand, coupled with the beliefs that the method should have a wider sphere of usefulness, has led the students to undertake the publication of this work, having first corresponded with a large number of the graduates of the college, many of whom are engaged in teaching and are using this system in their schools. The response was hearty and unanimous, and the author has reluctantly yielded to the solicitations of his pupils to give the work to the public and supervise its publication." Now, what do you see here? Students were, as expected, becoming teachers. Teachers who cared what they taught, took great initiative, who sought out new methods. This is in stark contrast to graduates from residential school, where the operators of the schools actually stood up in Parliament and reassured MPs that the graduates of these schools would never take jobs from their children, and that they were only being trained to be servants and laborers. Really, my summary of the impact of these schools is this. They were a tool created to crush creativity, freedom, love. A tool to take young people and mold them into something that was as far from God's character as possible, with the goal of destroying their communities and locking them into whatever identity their teachers gave them, usually one with no voice. As a result, students found it hard to even tell of their experiences and figure out what those experiences meant for them themselves. They were left with arbitrary structure, legalism, and not a way of looking at the world that allows for really respectful or open communication. Now, the other thing you need to know about residential schools is that they are not a new thing. Daniel and his 3 friends went to a residential school. And as I mentioned earlier, the Waldensians dealt with residential schools for centuries. Theirs closed only a few years before the same organizations began operating residential schools here in Canada on behalf of the government. And Adventists also wanted to have residential schools. The Hazelden SDA Church property and area around it was initially purchased for that reason. Now, when we as a church tell the history of religious persecutions, we focus on the survivors more so than on those who weren't able to make it. But partially this is because the story of the survivors is an empowering story of resilience we hold on to when times are tough, because we're part of that lineage of stories. In fact, I love, now that I say that, I always think if there's a YouTube series called Lineage Journey, where they are telling all these stories that shape who we are today, going back to the time of Christ. Now, the story of when we tell stories of communities going through traumas, sometimes it's hard to see that resilience when we're still in the middle of surviving. The stories we tell to explain to ourselves why our parents or grandparents are messed up, or why we are struggling with the things we are struggling with, can very easily focus on the downward trend rather than on the things that have gotten us this far. This way of thinking can end up demotivating us, justifying the fact that it sucks to be at the bottom, without really pushing back against Satan's lie that might makes right, or that the world is about looking out for number one. But when we tell our stories with our resilience included, these stories become the message of the gospel. The idea that love for our fellow man and the character of Christ is something that will lead to the healing of the nations. And when I look about this, I can see how these stories appealed to my grandfather. The stories of another community who shares their stories of resilience, going from the beginning of Christ through to the present, telling how they have survived through all of these challenges. It's a hopeful story. So that's why when I pass on the stories and tools from the past 150 years of survival through religious and cultural persecution, my focus is on what we call resilience, the strength of people. And I share the lows and the struggles only to better illustrate the capacity of our communities to pull together in order to better inspire us to continue on. Now, in this vein, I know stories of many communities who had early warning systems and permanent lookouts to warn of the arrival of the RCMP, of hiding places, or of families moving out onto the land for years or sending their children to relatives to keep them from being taken. I know stories of daring rescues directly from schools, spent by years living on the run with their kids until they aged out, or of the escapes that I've already shared from my own family. People learned to protect their hearts, their minds, when going through experiences or living in situations that would otherwise have left them powerless. Individuals would choose to resist unjust laws and take the consequences in order to show their communities, especially younger generations, that we still have pride and to not let go of our hope and vision for the future. I know a number of stories of guys who in Bella Coola who would go logging illegally in their own territories, where they knew that they had their own right to log. And when arrested and fined for it, they would just go back and log again to pay the fine. Or guys who would be arrested for fishing in their own fishing holes. And people who were too scared to do it would always take comfort knowing that other guys weren't too scared, even if they got arrested. People would learn not to be cowed by those who tried to treat them as less human, because by treating others as human, it forces them to see us as humans as well. For many people, certain aspects of Christianity really helped. Think of the teachings of Jesus about how to deal with powerlessness. He told us that when they hurt you, heap coals of fire on their head by repaying evil with good. When the Roman soldier applies a law that allows them to force you to carry their pack 1 mile, you smile, then carry it an extra mile, no worries. You're no longer a victim giving in to a superior person. Instead, as a human being, an equal child of God, you are acting as a loving member of your community, not as a cowed second-class member of the oppressor's world, and that experience is not something that they can deny. All of these tools, all of these hopes, including prophecies, got people through these times, and through telling the stories, most communities have had the strength to maintain their values to today. Something we also recognize as Adventists when we quote Ellen White saying, "We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teachings in our past history." This is why I strongly believe that as Adventist communities, we need to pass on our own stories, not just through the amazing writings of Adventist historians like George Knight, but also as congregations, sharing the heartaches and triumphs of our local communities, letting new people be a part of a story of dedication and commitment that comes down to them that they belong to. I mean, we could do it the way the Bible does, which is through including genealogies. In this context, most First Nations or Métis communities today view our journey towards being who we want to be through roughly two perspectives, or as being part of two projects that are really kind of one. The first project or perspective is deliberately pushing back against hurtful beliefs and narratives about who we are that other communities have imposed on us. We push back against it by teaching our youth that they matter, showing them that stereotypes aren't truth, by showing them that our own knowledge about the land is insightful, not simplistic, by showing that a way of life that is holistic gives better results for our communities, our governance, our land, our resources, not just for us, but for everybody. We've watched as pretty much every major fishery collapsed, as logging collapsed, as trapping collapsed, and people are starting to realize that maybe commodifying everything is not a long-term solution. This pushing back against the ways people have threatened us or hurt us in a sort of a reactionary way is known as decolonization. The second project or perspective expands on this in a really important way. It starts when we are able to stop caring about how others see us, stop defining ourselves only in terms of our differences from somebody else, and instead learn to accept that we are children of our Creator just as much as anyone else, with the freedom to use our creativity to build relationships and decide what matters to us. For a parallel Adventist example, first think of of how Adventist theologians pushed back against people we felt threatened by, and we ended up defining ourselves using somebody else's questions, for example, in the book Questions on Doctrine. Or contrast this with how we use our understanding of the cosmic conflict between Christ's plan and character, and Satan's, in order to explain our beliefs about the Sabbath, the state of the dead, the second coming, the judgment, the health message, education, and most importantly, who God is, and our loving relationship with him, all in a way that is healthy and uplifting. This approach of valuing and treasuring your own context, not defining your work or your values through somebody else's values or perspective, is called resurgence, or even sometimes revival. A second example would be the rise of fundamentalism in the 1920s, and how, where people said, we are being threatened in these ways, so pushing back against these threats is now our most important beliefs. We're defining ourselves by how we feel threatened. Now, many Adventists gave in to reacting to change in a fear-based way, rather than by doubling down on the power of a loving God to keep our communities impactful in a hurting world. Now, for many First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities, these projects has meant supporting the teaching and use of our own languages, for example, as a way of showing that just because something is small, or just because your community isn't big, doesn't make it any less meaningful or powerful, and it doesn't make you any less important to God. It means that we are free to develop opinions about things that don't matter to others. But that's okay, because we're working towards building meaning in a good way, not just working to fit in. It has meant bringing back our stories, our songs, our ways of dressing, our healthy food. It has meant wanting to be stewards of our own health, our own education rather than being wards of somebody else. It means making choices, not just existing. Being a peculiar people is fine. So I've shared some of my experiences or the experiences of my community or communities I've been a part of, as well as given an idea of what we value and what we are working towards, the needs that we see in the world. The question then is how you as a community can be impacted by this knowledge. How can it impact what we do? Can this little bit of truth help us as we try to share how the love and humility of Jesus has been a tool for us in working towards those same goals? Now, I can tell you one way that often hasn't been effective: pulling people one at a time out of their communities or trying to make them a part of our communities. Over and over, I've seen and known many Indigenous people who have come to Adventist for the messages or the promise, but then left the community because while it seems to care about them as individuals, our culture often isn't able to understand that they are looking for tools to serve their community. In fact, in many areas of Canada, there are communities where many, many people will tell Statistics Canada that they are Adventist, but our church organization doesn't have an idea that they exist. This includes places where, the Adventist, missionary boat last went there in the 40s, and there's still people there who call themselves Adventists today. This is in part because many Indigenous people view churches as clubs, while community is family. Clubs are where you go to get some training, but your community is where you bring that training, that learning back to. Really, we need to respect people's commitment to their communities, their responsibilities, and in fact, all their relationships. And that means seeing people as members of their communities and supporting people as members of their communities, their nations, with their visions for the future. Thinking about this, I believe that the first thing that we can and should do as communities is to learn our own stories and figure out what we are working towards. What are our goals for the future? And I don't want mean membership numbers. I mean, what are the strengths we believe that the next generation will need in order to learn from and share with people who are passionate and very well educated about how to support their community? We have to be invested in our own. We have to learn to take our responsibility to future generations just as seriously as those we are trying to reach already do. The second thing is that we can learn about the values, projects, and passions of other people's communities as told through their stories. Compare your stories to those of another congregation, maybe one not so similar to yours or one that's fairly close. What are your differences? We can find opportunities to discuss and share our parallel struggles with empowering youth, building connections and giving people meaning in a messed up world, maybe even find things to work on together. This sharing can be done with no strings attached. Sharing our experiences with the same spirit that Christ had when he freely shared the parables with us. And we can share the Bible in the same way. It's the story of a community going through colonization 6 times, finding what works, what doesn't, how to stay true to their values when they're powerless, or how to go back to them when they get the power. How to rebuild their identity through books in a language they no longer speak. All of these are things that are profoundly impactful to people and can be shared with no strings attached, regardless of what that person's views are on God, on Christianity. Learning where we come from and finding where others come from. What we are working towards and what they are working towards can help as we try to do what Christ did, to mingle with people as one who desires their good, showing sympathy for them, ministering to their needs, and earning each other's confidence. Let's remember how the Lord has led us and his teachings in our past history so we can also be a part of healing the world.